3 disturbing true roommate horror stories. It was late in September when Jenna moved into her new apartment. She was excited to start fresh, having recently transferred to a new university. The rent was cheap, and the place was only a short walk from campus. Everything seemed perfect, except for one thing. Her new roommate, Beth, was different. Jenna met Beth on her first day, and she immediately noticed something odd. Beth was quiet, too quiet. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was only in short, clipped sentences. Her pale skin and dark, sunken eyes gave her an eerie look, but Jenna figured Beth was just shy. After all, it's tough moving in with strangers. But as the days passed, Jenna began to feel uneasy. Beth never left her room. She never ate with Jenna, never joined her for conversations, and only appeared in the middle of the night, wandering silently through the apartment. Jenna would hear her footsteps in the hall, light but persistent, moving from room to room. One night, Jenna woke up to the sound of creaking. At first, she thought it was just the old apartment settling, but then she heard it again. It was the sound of a door slowly opening. Jenna's heart pounded as she lay frozen in bed, listening. The sound grew louder, and then she heard something else, the faint sound of breathing, just outside her bedroom door. Terrified, Jenna kept still, her eyes fixed on the crack beneath the door. Suddenly, she saw shadows, feet standing right outside. Jenna held her breath, praying Beth would go away. Minutes passed, but the shadow remained. Then, without warning, the door slowly creaked open. Beth stood there, her face expressionless, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Beth?" Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. Beth said nothing, just stared at her with those hollow eyes. Without another word, Beth turned and walked away, leaving the door wide open. Jenna didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Jenna confronted Beth, asking if she had entered her room. Beth denied everything, her voice flat and emotionless. Confused and frightened, Jenna began to avoid her, spending as little time in the apartment as possible. One evening, while sitting in the kitchen, Jenna decided to do some research. She searched the apartment's history online, hoping to find an explanation for Beth's strange behavior. What she found chilled her to the bone. 3 years earlier, a girl named Beth had lived in the apartment. She had been found dead, murdered in her room by her own roommate, who had vanished without a trace. The photo attached to the article showed a girl who looked exactly like Beth, the same pale skin, the same dark, sunken eyes. Jenna's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The girl living with her wasn't Beth, it was the roommate, pretending to be her. Terrified, Jenna packed her things and left that very night, never looking back. Jacob was a college student, looking for a cheap place to stay. When he found a room in a shared apartment for an unbelievable price, he jumped at the chance. The place was a bit run down, but Jacob didn't care. He was sharing it with a guy named Greg, who seemed friendly enough, quiet, but polite. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Jacob would go to class, come home, and Greg would often be in his room. He never seemed to leave the apartment, which Jacob found odd, but he didn't question it. One night, Jacob heard strange noises coming from Greg's room. At first, it was a low humming sound, like something electrical. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder, almost like a whirring or grinding noise. It stopped suddenly, and the apartment fell silent again. Jacob brushed it off, assuming Greg was working on something. But the next night, the noises started again. This time, it was louder and more frequent, as if something mechanical was being built. Curiosity got the better of him, and Jacob knocked on Greg's door. There was no answer. Jacob pressed his ear to the door, listening. The noise stopped abruptly. He knocked again, this time louder. Still no answer. Frustrated, Jacob returned to his room, but the noises kept him awake all night. The next morning, Jacob finally asked Greg what was going on. Greg smiled nervously and said he was just working on a personal project. Jacob didn't push the issue, but the explanation didn't sit right with him. The noises continued, growing more frequent and more disturbing. One night, unable to sleep, Jacob decided to investigate. He waited until Greg had left the apartment, and then he entered Greg's room. The room was spotless, except for one thing, a small hole in the wall behind Greg's bed. Jacob crouched down to inspect the hole, but what he saw horrified him. Inside the wall was a hidden space. No larger than a closet, and inside that space was a camera. A camera pointed directly at his room. Jacob's skin crawled as he realized that Greg had been spying on him the entire time. Every move, every private moment, Greg had been watching. Disgusted and terrified, Jacob immediately moved out of the apartment, leaving without a word. It wasn't until weeks later that Jacob learned the truth. Greg had been arrested, caught trying to lure another tenant into his twisted games. Jacob had narrowly escaped becoming another victim. Sophie had always been a light sleeper. Every little sound would wake her up, but she never imagined that moving into her new apartment would make sleep impossible. She found a place in a quiet neighborhood, sharing a room with a girl named Claire. At first, Claire seemed like the perfect roommate, calm, clean, and considerate. But as the nights passed, Sophie began to notice something strange. Every night, around midnight, Claire would start murmuring to herself. At first, it was quiet, almost inaudible, but as the weeks went on, the murmuring grew louder and more intense. One night, Sophie couldn't take it anymore. She rolled over in bed and asked Claire if she was okay. But Claire didn't respond. She just continued murmuring, her words garbled and unintelligible. Sophie sat up, staring at Claire in the darkness. That's when she noticed something truly disturbing. Claire's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, her lips moving rapidly. It was as if she was in a trance. Terrified, Sophie got out of bed and turned on the light. Claire immediately stopped, blinking as if she had just woken up. "Are you okay?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Claire looked confused, as if she had no idea what had just happened. The next day, Sophie tried to brush off the incident as a one-time thing. But the murmuring continued, growing more disturbing with each passing night. It wasn't just talking, Claire was whispering in another language, one Sophie couldn't understand. Determined to find out what was going on, Sophie did some research. She learned that Claire had a troubled past, involving a history of sleepwalking and episodes of dissociation. But what scared Sophie the most was a rumor she found online, about a girl who had been possessed while living in the same building years ago. The thought sent chills down Sophie's spine. Could Claire be experiencing something similar? Was she speaking to someone, or something, while she slept? One night, Sophie decided to stay awake and watch Claire. As midnight approached, the murmuring began again. But this time, it was different. Claire sat up in bed, her eyes still wide open, and began speaking in a deep, guttural voice that was not her own. "She's here," Claire whispered, her voice low and menacing. "She's watching." Sophie's heart raced as she watched Claire, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, Claire turned her head, her unblinking eyes locking onto Sophie's. A sinister smile spread across Claire's face, and Sophie felt her blood run cold. "She's coming for you next," Claire whispered, her voice dripping with malice. Terrified, Sophie grabbed her things and fled the apartment, never to return. She later learned that Claire had been hospitalized, diagnosed with a severe dissociative disorder. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something darker, lurking inside her roommate. Moral lesson. These stories remind us that the people we live with may not always be who they seem. Sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't the shadows outside our windows, but the ones that live right next to us. Trust your instincts, and never ignore the signs, because you never truly know what darkness hides behind closed doors. In the end, it's not just about finding the right place to live, but about being cautious of the company we keep.